Quick quilting by machine is what is in store for you today. Welcome, I'm Nancy Zieman. There's a lot more to machine quilting than just sewing the layers together. The road to quick quilting is paved with time-saving notions and updated techniques. I'd like to start by creating a quilt sandwich with a special pinning process. Then I'll show you a quick machine quilting technique called stitching in the ditch. That's what's up next on Sewing with Nancy.
Sewing with Nancy, TV's how-to sewing program with Nancy Zieman, is brought to you by PFAFF, the largest European producer of sewing machines. PFAFF's creative line of sewing machines and hobby lock sergers are simply the best. Ginger, a tradition of quality in scissors and shears for home, classroom, and industry. Ginger scissors and shears are the choice of professionals. Oxmoor House, the publisher of fine sewing, quilting, and craft books, including Nancy's books and the Sew for Fun collection, Sew Easy, Sew Now. Madeira thread from Germany with superior quality and smart packaging to make it a sensational value, preferred by home and professional embroiderers everywhere. And by Nancy's Notions catalog, featuring specialty sewing books and unique, hard-to-find sewing notions and supplies.
During this series on quick machine quilting, I'm going to concentrate on putting the three layers of a quilt together: the top, batting, and the backing. I'd like to detail those areas and point out a few ideas that might help speed along your quilting process. I just have a sample of a patchwork area. Obviously, you need a much larger section for a quilt top, but what I'd like to point out is on the flip side. For easy machine quilting, using the stitching in the ditch concept, which I'm going to show you first, I like to have the seams pressed open rather than to one side. Generally, for strip quilting ideas, we press all the seams in one direction. But I'm going to be sewing in the well of the seam where the two fabrics meet, and having the seams pressed open will make this stitching, machine stitching, go so much more smoothly. So keep that in mind. Now for the batting, sometimes called quilt bats, spelled B-A-T-T. There are three types: cotton, polyester, and wool battings. The cotton battings are what I like to suggest for beginner machine quilters. They're lightweight, they drape well, soft. They need to be quilted about every 1 to 2 inches, so you can't have wide stitching lines apart, but 1 to 2 inches apart. Polyester bats are probably a little bit more common. They're high loft, they're much thicker. They are sold by ounces. There may be a 10-ounce bat, a 12-ounce bat, 8-ounce. That depends upon the weight per yard and the thickness, of course. 10 ounces is what I'd recommend for machine quilting. You'll notice on these bats that there's kind of a scrim or an extra layer of fabric kind of holding all the polyester together. Or in this instance, the batting has been pressed or has been heat set so that the fibers stay together. Wool is another suggestion for batting. Lofty, drapeable, like cotton, has to be quilted every 2 inches or so. Now for the backing, very simple. Just use the same quality fabric as you're going to use for the top. Perhaps you may want to consider a supersized muslin that's 90 to 120 inches wide. I like those. You don't have to piece it if you're working with large comforters or quilts, but I'm just going to use a cotton fabric to work with my child's blanket or a kid's blanket. Now to put all these three layers together, I like to work in 2 steps. First of all, the top and the batting. I have it somewhat started for this little quilt. I've placed the batting and top together, and on a flat surface, a large table or the floor, starting at the center to kind of smooth the edges to make sure everything's uniform, and just use pins, stick pins, straight pins, to pin the layers together periodically. This is a temporary pinning, not permanent. You just want to pin a few key areas so that these 2 layers are treated as one. After you have it pinned periodically throughout the quilt, gently roll it, set it aside, and then with the backing fabric, place wrong side up on your tabletop or floor and tape into place. I'm going to use masking tape. I like to secure it along all the edges. You might want to get a friend, sewing buddy, to help you for this process. And then after taping it down with your socks, if you're working on the floor, walk over and place the quilt top on top of this. Now I'm working with small quilts in this series, but this concept would work with large or small. Now I've cut the backing so I would have at least a 3-inch border all the way around. I'll just do a quick check to make sure I have enough fabric. Keep it on grain, keep it straight. Once you get it somewhat positioned, again, start at that center point. Rather than using the regular sewing pins, I'm going to use curved safety pins. These are meant for quilting to attach all the layers together. kind of cute looking pins, but the purpose of these pins is to make it easier to go through all the layers. Just grab that backing and then pin. Starting at the center and then working to the sides. Start at the center and work out every 4 inches or so. Now I'm going to kind of determine that for this stitching idea, I'm going to stitch in the well of these seams. So I'm not going to stitch over the seam allowance, but within the straight fabric. And you just keep moving and folding. The concept of pinning the top layer and the batting together just secures those 2 layers together, so you're not trying to get 3 layers at one time to be together or on one plane. Now after you've done a lot of pinning with the safety pins, then remove the stick pins. And obviously I haven't pinned my whole quilt. And then the next step would be to remove the basting tape or masking tape from the quilt as well as from you. And then roll each side to the middle. We're going to start sewing the middle of the quilt, just like pinning in the middle. We'll start sewing in the middle. Roll the sides, then either pin the 2 together, or I'm going to use some quilter's clamps to do the holding. And you do the same on the other side. I'll continue getting this quilt ready, and the next stop will be to do the sewing. Off camera I did some additional pinning of my quilt and re-rolled the fabric, have it ready to do the stitching. But right now I'd like to explain how I have the machine set up. Probably the most important addition to doing machine quilting is to make certain that you have a walking foot or a dual feet attachment on your machine. The walking foot is kind of a funny contraption, but it fits over the needle bar. There's a position that fits over the needle bar so that as the fabrics go through, this walks the layers evenly through the stitching, preventing the layers from shifting, I should say. On my machine, my dual feed mechanism attaches, and it does the same thing by having the top and bottom layers plus the batting layers feed evenly, preventing the shifting. For the threads, for the stitch in the ditch type of quilting, I like to use monofilament thread or clear thread. You can hardly see it, like fine fishing line. You can use either the clear or the smoke color. And for the bobbin, use cotton thread that it matches the color of your fabric. I have yellow in my bobbin right now. Machine quilting needles are sold, just like that. They're sharp needles so that they penetrate all these layers. Now I'm ready to do the stitching, starting in the center of the quilt. I'm going to stitch in the well of the machine, find that top thread, set it aside, and then lower the presser foot area so that you're going to stitch right in the middle of the seam. Now that seam has been pressed open, it will go so much more easily. I have my machine set at 0 stitches per inch. I'm going to sew 2 or 3 stitches in place and then set it for the regular stitching and sew. If possible, stop with the needle in the down position. I'll push that button for turning of corners, and then raise the presser foot and pivot. Now this is probably the most difficult, if you call it difficult, but it takes a little time if you have a lot of quilt to deal with. Get it repositioned, lower the presser bar again, use your left and right hands to hold the fabric flat, and sew. Sewing in the well of the seam. Raise the presser foot, reposition the fabric. This is where it has to be kind of closely rolled together. Make sure the fabric's flat. Probably the first stitching is the most difficult, sewing in the center. After you've stitched the center, you'll find that you'll be working in the sides. You'll have less fabric to contend with. Stitching the ditch is not new to those of you who have been sewing for a long time. It's used possibly in sewing cuffs, sewing waistbands, many areas. Now when you get near a safety pin as I am here, you can just kind of tilt it to the side and then stop. And I'm almost completed 1 block stitching for my little baby quilt. And after I get to my starting spot, just again set the machine at 0 stitches per inch, sew 2 or 3 stitches to lock the threads. Now you can raise the needle, raise the presser foot, and advance it to the next section you'd like to quilt. Lower down the presser foot, again lock 2 or 3 stitches. When I'm finished, I'm going to clip all the threads from the top and bottom, but this way they'll be all locked by the straight stitching in place. And then just continue the stitching. And doing the same process, not difficult at all. And let me stop with the needle in the down position. And just keep moving the fabric and working it, smoothing it out, working from the center outward. Now the next step after doing this will be, as I mentioned, to cut all the threads, and we'll show you later some other finishing techniques, but let me show you the completed stitching in the ditch on another quilt. This sample shows two types of machine quilting. I'd like to concentrate on the stitching in the ditch, stitching in the well of the seam right where the fabric's meeting. You can see on the wrong side how straight the stitching is. It's a very simple way of working with quick machine quilting by machine. Another quick way of machine quilting is with diagonal machine quilting. This requires a lot of marking of the top layer of the quilt prior to doing stitching. I'm going to be working on a very small piece of fabric, but you would use the same concept if you're working on a very large comforter or a small quilt or just a little placemat size that I have here. The first concept is if this were quilted, pieced I should say, or just plain fabric, you would still need to do markings. The marking is probably the most important part. For cotton or wool battings, mark every 2 inches, and for polyester battings about 4 to 6 inches across all long and short edges. What this means is place a tape measure along the top edge, and after marking the top we'll move it to the lower edge and mark accurately as possible every 2 inches. Now it's kind of important that the last marking is at the corner, so even if it isn't exactly at the 2-inch mark, fudge it a little bit and make believe that's a 2-inch marking. If you had a little bit more fabric, you may want to reposition your marks so that perhaps they were 2 1/8 inches at the very end, but approximately 2 inches. Then do the same marking, the mirror image marking along the lower edge, as well as each side. So you're marking for the machine quilting. These are just the preliminary marks. We're going to have many more marks as we go along, and they are going to be made with a plumb line. Well, this method was designed by Ernest Haight, who has this terrific way of machine quilting without having the fabric in the bed of the machine. The most of the fabric is to the left of the needle. You can use a plumb line. I'm going to use a carpenter's line and reel to do this. You really need 4 hands. I'm going to do it with 2, so it's going to look a little bit awkward. The talcum powder we placed in the reel area, and you kind of pull out your chalk and align it by the 2 markings on the side. And I'm going to kind of anchor this, make sure the marks are lined up, and give the string a snap. Find the next markings along both sides, line it up, hold it taut, and snap. Again, this is a small piece, so you can see why you need 4 hands to do it. Get your sewing buddy to do this with you. After marking one diagonal area, then flip it around and go to the other side and cross the marks, and I'll just find the marks at the top and bottom, and you'll see you have to dust out the talcum powder before pulling out of the reel and snap it. But you mark the whole quilt in this manner. Now you may think, why do this on such a small quilt? You could certainly work with a ruler and pencil, yes of course, but if you have a big piece of fabric, this works out very well, providing you get a little helping hand. After marking the quilt top, then I pinned it together, and this is not a quilt top, it's a small sample, but pin it together from the center on out in between the markings, the quilt markings, because I'm going to be stitching on these lines. The key area is to start at the upper left-hand corner, and we're going to stitch down the center, following the line. When I run out of fabric, I'll pivot the fabric 90 degrees, and there I'll find another line. Stop at the end of the fabric and find the next one, pivot 90 degrees. And you'll keep working around your quilt top. After about 5 to 6 passes, you'll find that you'll stop or will not have any fabric to pivot to. Right here is the point, there's nothing to pivot to. So then what I'll be doing is flipping it around and starting at the new left-hand corner and doing the stitching. Eventually, by pivoting and turning, the whole quilt top will be machine quilted. I'd like to show you how to do that right now at the sewing machine. As I mentioned just a few seconds ago, I'm going to start sewing in the upper left-hand corner and sewing this first long line. This will probably be where you'll have the most fabric bulk in the bed or this tight area of your sewing machine. How it got the name bed, I don't know, but that's what it's called. The machine setup is just like I had before, only I've switched to using cotton thread on the top as well so you could see the stitching more clearly. Just stitch following the line. When I reach the safety pin area, just put it to the side and use your hands to flatten out the fabric. this is a small sample, so I don't have the bulk that you will have when you're working with a larger quilt. But the concept is just exactly the same. So this first long line is where you'll have the most fabric in this area of the machine. As I'm reaching the end of my line, I raise the presser bar, flip the fabric 90 degrees, kind of reposition everything, lower the presser bar, and sew the next line. Simple as that. Again, you could use the chalk line to do the marking, or in a smaller piece, use a ruler and fabric marking pencil. I'm at the end again, flip and turn. 90 degrees, there'll be another line waiting for me to stitch. I found that you have to work on a rectangle shape, a square. You will not be able to do this shaping, this type of stitching as accurately as this. And then pivot, just like that. You don't have to do a lot of cutting of threads. That's what makes it so good. And you can see the bulk of the fabric is to my left. And so, I'm almost finished with this first pass. And then I'll show you what to work with in the second pass. Well, I think I have about one more row of stitching left. And then I'll flip the fabric around. Doing the stitching just takes a little time, and working on the bias, stitching on the diagonal, really it is very smooth. The way the fabric stretches is the way you're going to be doing the stitching. Now for the next pass, when I run out of areas to sew, when I pivot the fabric there isn't a line there, we're going to switch the whole quilt top around. You can see I have about 5 or 6 rows stitched, and now this upper left-hand corner I'm going to switch it, turn it so that I have a new upper left-hand corner and start in that same area and just do the stitching. As you can see, this isn't very difficult. It just takes some time on fuller-sized quilts to get all the way around the stitching. I have not done this on large quilts, but on baby-sized quilts, and it works out very well. After doing the second pass, you'll have the same number of rows of stitching as you did for the first pass. Then simply find, again, that left-hand corner. Even though that very corner row has been stitched, go down one row and start the whole process all over again. And just keep turning. This works out well. Rather than sewing all crosswise rows in one direction, it prevents shifting of the fabric. That's one of the beauties of using this technique. I'll just do a couple more rows. You get the concept of how this works. It's fun. Move those safety pins out of the way. Even though I have another row to stitch, I'll just show you what we work with next. If you ran out of rows to do the stitching, then you'd go back to the upper left-hand corner and go down one area. Use this as your starting area for your third pass and do the stitching. After that row has been stitched, flip the quilt around, go again to the new upper left-hand corner and down one row. And after doing the stitching, I believe in this quilt pattern, the small one, we'd have the whole quilt stitched with 4 passes. It's a quick way of doing machine quilting. Before doing machine quilting, it's necessary to put all 3 layers of the quilt together. And I like to do that in a 2-step process. First of all, work with the quilt top and the batting and pin them together with straight pins starting at the center, periodically placing the pins. Then take this one unit, place it on top of the backing fabric. Now pin together securely with safety pins. I like the curved safety pins. It makes it easier to hoop or catch all 3 layers of fabric together. Then remove the straight pins and you're ready to do the quilting. New from Oxmoor House, the Sew for Fun collection, So Easy, Sew Now. Quick ways to sew gifts, accessories, clothing, and more. Order now. You'll receive free 7 project cards, a pattern sheet, binder and dividers, and my new monthly newsletter. You'll also receive more project cards to preview for 30 days, no obligation. If you decide to keep them, we'll bill you only $5.98 plus shipping and handling. Then about once a month, you'll receive 2 new sets of projects in my free newsletter at the same low price. Keep only shipments you want, cancel anytime. Call 1-800-765-6400, and so easy, so now. Ginger Incorporated, the manufacturer of the finest quality scissors and shears, has been a sponsor of Sewing with Nancy for more than 10 years. Each article in their complete assortment is manufactured with care and attention to detail, whether cutting, nipping, pinking, clipping, or trimming. There is a Ginger product designed for that job. Join me in thanking Ginger Incorporated for their dedicated sponsorship. Thanks for joining me. I'm Nancy Zieman. This is the second program on my 3-part series on quick quilting by machine. My first project features a high-tech fabric with traditional machine stitching. I'll show you how to make a polar quilt using high-loss fleece. The fleece serves as the batting and backing to create comfy blankets. You'll be amazed how this outerwear fabric doubles as a perfect quilting component. That's what's next on Sewing with Nancy. Traditionally, quilts are made with 3 layers of fabric, the top, the batting, and then the backing. But for the polar quilt, we're going to eliminate the batting layer, the middle layer, because we're working with a specialty high-loft fleece. On our finished stadium blanket, we just chose a cotton print, obviously football theme, and then used the polar fleece, Eskimo fleece, whatever type of name it has, as the backing and batting in one. The fabric doesn't ravel, so this is a raw edge. We're going to be cutting the fleece larger than the print to bring it to the right side and just stitch it into place. I'll show you how to put the 2 layers together, really a very quick way of quilting. Now the fleece is sold 60 inches wide, and usually cotton prints are 45 inches wide, so you're going to have a little extra fleece to possibly make some mittens or a scarf after you're finished. As you can see that we have this somewhat positioned so that the fleece is about 1.5 inches, however large or wide you'd like the border to be when you're finished. This comes to be about 1 inch after it's folded. If you'd like it wider or narrower, the choice is yours. Just make certain that you have an equal border around the cut edge of the print. Place the print on top of the fleece, wrong sides together, starting in the middle, and pin the 2 layers together. In our first program of this series, I showed you how to pin all 3 layers of a quilt together with curved safety pins. You could definitely do the same technique here. Using the curved pin really works out quite nicely because the curve helps you scoop all the fabric and then pin together. Another concept I like to use for smaller quilts is a basting gun, where the little plastic areas, let me put it in a white area so you can see a little bit more closely. The gun shoots the plastic tack through all the layers, and then after you're done quilting, you just snip that off. It's kind of a fast way of putting the 2 layers together. I really like this best for smaller projects, not for large ones, because you need your hand underneath the layers. Work from the center out, pinning all the layers, tacking them together, whatever method you'd like to use, so that they all are nicely together. As I mentioned, we're using a fabric print. I would not recommend this technique for a beautifully pieced quilt top. This is a quick quilting idea, but perfect for, as I mentioned, a stadium blanket, a kid's blanket, something for the car. Now when working at stitching, I'm going to introduce you to channel stitching, vertical rows or horizontal rows, parallel rows stitched on the machine. On this print, it gives me a perfect palette where to stitch. I'm going to stitch along each red line, the red borders separating the top and lower sections, so I have excellent ways of knowing exactly where to stitch. And I'm going to be stitching in alternating lines. First of all, I'm going to stitch from the top to the lower edge, and then coming up at the other side, the lower edge to the top, top to the lower edge to the top. The changing of the sections or the stitching lines will prevent the shifting of the fabric all in one direction. It will keep things more evenly spaced. I'd like to start sewing from the center of the quilt. So to do this, I'm simply going to roll the edges to the middle, and you can attach them with bicycle clips or jaws, and we'll be ready to do our first channel stitching. I have my Polar Quilt all ready to do the channel stitching. It's a lot of straight stitching. This is rather a large stadium blanket, so I'm going to work on a very smaller, much smaller scale piece just to show you the concept of the directional stitching. The machine setup for working with channel stitching is the same as I worked with in the first program of this series. Using clear monofilament thread in the needle thread, the thread will blend with whatever fabric you're working with, use either the clear or the smoke color. And then for the bobbin thread, just use thread that matches your fabric. I'm going to use red for the little sample I'm working with, red thread in the bobbin. The needle, I'd like to use a machine quilting needle, or if you'd like to use a metafill needle to work with the monofilament thread, the choice is yours. You can use whatever you'd like in this instance. Start in the center of the quilt, and I'm going to start in the center of my little sample. Stitching down the designated area that I would like to have the quilting. Now you're going to have to use your hands on this larger piece just to hold the fabric flat and stitch following a line or portion of the design. With channel quilting, I do like to raise the presser foot and flip the fabric around so that instead of sewing all in one direction, I'm sewing from the bottom to top in one layer and top to bottom in the other direction. And just sew. Straight stitch. It's a great beginner project because the monofilament thread blends right in with the fabric, so if you needed to have a little crooked stitch, which most of the time I have, it's going to blend right in with the fabric. I'm going very quickly now because I have such a small piece. It'll take you a little bit longer with larger pieces, but the concept here is the same. The corners are what will be next, and I'm going to just put the sample up on my board to show you how I like to miter this corner. As I mentioned, the polar fleece doesn't ravel, so we can have raw edges. At the corner, the first thing to do is to fold under a corner, like a right triangle, and the fold is right at the point of the top fabric. Fold it under. Then fold the sides along the edge, cut edge of the fabric, bringing the fleece to the right side, and either clip or pin in place. This is rather high loft, so sometimes on the edges I like to use the clips. And on the opposite side, again, fold, creating a miter, just like a picture frame. This may take a little positioning time to make certain that all those areas are meeting. After I sew around the edges, I like to kind of pin the miter together, restitch that, and I'll show you in the finished quilt. But now I'll just keep on folding under the sides. I have quite a wide border on this sample. On our finished stadium blanket, it was only about 3/4 of an inch. The choice is yours, whatever size you'd like to make this. Straight stitching right along this edge or zigzagging is a good choice for attaching the binding area, which is really the backing, to the front of your quilt. I'm going to just quickly change this to a straight stitch. There we go. One more time. And stitch along the edge, encompassing the edge. And it's very quick to work with. After you've stitched along the edges, then you can go back and stitch in the mitered area to secure everything down. Let me show you this on the finished quilt one more time. We have the border just straight stitched along the edge. Very neat finish. On the inside, you can see the channel stitching. And following the helmets, we did a little extra stitching following the outline just to have that area stitched as well. So with very quick stitching, you have a very quick blanket called a polar quilt. For more quick quilting by machine ideas, I'd like to introduce you to a sampling of straight stitch techniques. This sampler showcases the traditional channel, diagonal, and other geometric machine quilting patterns. I'll show you how to be accurate yet efficient in stitching with the use of specialty gridded paper. Here's how. Now this sampler quilt isn't possibly something that you'd really make, but was a perfect way for us to showcase the various ways of stitching layers of fabric together. I just showed you the channel stitching on our Polar Quilt. Well, this is more traditional channel stitching with the stitching closer together. The diagonal stitching just is channel stitching with the mirror image, so that the channel stitching one direction and also in the other direction. This requires marking of the fabric we used the lines of the printed fabric earlier, the design as a stitching guideline. On a solid fabric, you'd have to mark your fabric using a fabric pencil or a quilting pencil. Again, stitching with the directionals, one way, flip it, go the other way, so that you're working with directional stitching. But some of the other stitching ideas require a little bit more of detail. So often in quilt books I see flame stitches, keyhole stitches, or possibly waves or clamshell stitches. And we have worked with a way to make it a little bit more efficient and easier to work with. This is a traditional flame stitch. Now we're working with all these little sample quilts. I'm going to show you how to make the flame stitch as well as kind of a quilt-as-you-go technique, which I'll show you in a little bit. But we've cut these squares of fabric, the top, the batting, and the backing, 9 to 12 inches square. Determine a square that you'd like. But rather than having on this flame stitch to mark all of these stitch areas, I'm going to introduce you working with gridded paper. We've used a lot of paper in sewing in recent Sewing with Nancy programs, and this gridded paper is like freezer paper. It has a wax backing, plus gridded surface with 1/4 of an inch grids on the paper side, and then the wax-like appearance on the wrong side. This wax appearance will press temporarily to fabric, making a perfect stitching guide. Out of the gridded paper, cut a flame stitch as wide as you'd like it, as long as you'd like it. This particular one was 1/2 of an inch wide, and each length of the stitch was about 1.5 inches long. This is just a guideline for you. You could do this on a very large quilt, small sample. We're going to use a small sample right now. And then you're going to position it on your fabric. Again, I'm going to work with small pieces of fabric, but I have all 3 layers, and I have pressed this onto a portion of it onto my sample. You could press 1 layer or 1 design or a couple of designs if you'd like in place so that you'd have them all positioned. In this small little one, I will measure or eyeball about 1/2 of an inch apart and press. Now, as I mentioned, this is a temporary idea. You're just going to position this in temporarily so that you can use it as a sewing guide. But it is a accurate and fast sewing guide. We were able to use these little sheets about 12 times, remove them after stitching, and stitch again. Reposition, I should say, first of all. I have my machine set up the same way as I worked with earlier for the Polar Quilt, but this time I've used cotton thread in the top as well as the bobbin for the needle and bobbin as well. And if you can, stop with the needle in the down position and just stitch following the guide. And it's just like painting by number. You follow lines. This is sewing by the edge of the paper. And sew. And just keep on going. Actually, the stability of that paper on the top of the fabric really does act as an additional stabilizer. Now, as this is such a small piece, I don't have a lot of pins in place. Of course, you would have pins in place to hold the layers together. But let me just show you what occurs after stitching. You just peel away the wax. Now I would need to stitch on the opposite side of this sheet, but just to show you how quickly this works. Then use that same paper, position it again, and press. And it will press just as easily the first time, as the second and third time as it did the first time. And that's how you can get the directional stitching, these specific designs, very easily. We did a couple of other ideas. I mentioned kind of a step-looking appearance of a quilt stitching. This showcases that step area. Whatever design you'd like works out well. The clamshell or wave stitch is a very elegant-looking quilting idea, but to mark your fabric in the past has been rather laborious to do all the markings. Again, we're going to use the paper. I cut a strip of paper of this gridded freezer-type paper about 2 inches wide. And then using a rounded surface like a coffee cup or a saucer, and down the center of the strip drew half shells, half circles. You can see I've separated the paper. Press, first of all, the outward curve to your fabric. And then after pressing, you can remove that outward curve piece. Then find the mirror image, the opposite section. At the tip of the wave, meet the point of the remaining piece and press into place. I think you can see that you'd be sewing on the inner side of the paper. This has a lot of potential for sewing, for creating designs by giving yourself a grid to work with. Let me show you another design on this sampler. This tile work, it looks like my kitchen floor, has radiated out squares, but to mark them in the fabric would take a lot of time. On this sample, we have marked the entire design on the gridded surface. You could highlight it with different colors so that you would know if you wanted to do different stitching. And then after doing the sewing, of course, first press it into place and then do the stitching around the edges. And I'll just peel this off. Will perforate, the stitching will perforate the paper. Now what I found to do is to work with a little shorter stitches per inch so that this perforates a little bit more readily. But you can see you can just tear that away and you have very accurate stitching. So those are a couple of ways of working with straight stitch quilting to give your designs some interest and personality. As I mentioned earlier, the sampler quilt not only showcases some machine stitching ideas, but also a concept of putting the quilt together. We have 9 blocks of machine stitching, but the stitching was accomplished putting all 3 layers together prior to attaching all the 9 blocks. On the flip side, we've used contrasting binding, something you wouldn't do on your actual quilt. You'd use the same color fabric, but just to show you how to bind these together with this quilt-as-you-go technique. Align all your blocks that have been machine quilted all together in a row, to create the blocks to create a row, and meet right sides together of 2 blocks, adjoining the sides that are going to be seamed together, and just pin. You might want to use long pins for this quick pinning idea. You're going to have lots of bulk and loft in here. Then out of a matching fabric or coordinating fabric, cut a 2-inch wide binding. This is a cross grain cut 2-inch strip folded in half, meeting wrong sides and long edges. And then meet this edge, the cut edges, to the edges of the fabric that have been already pinned. If you place the pin heads toward the edges, this will make faster pinning. Cut the binding at this appropriate length and sew with a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance all the way down. Now if possible, I like to kind of stop my machine quilting before this 1/4 of an inch seam so you could get in here and trim away the extra batting if it was a little bit too bulky. Then open this flat. Remember, this is the wrong side, and finger press, or press if you'd like, the binding over the seam allowance and pin. The next step requires hand stitching. Great thing to do while you're sitting watching TV, just hand stitch these areas down to catch it into place. Again, this will be in matching fabric, not contrasting fabric. First of all, stitch all the vertical rows, putting the binding into place, and then after creating the rows, then you can attach the rows together with the same concept. Here we have 2 blocks that have been seamed, and then the rows, you can see the longer continuous strip. Notice how we've alternated the seam allowance, the bulk of the seam one time going to the left and the other time going to the right, so it would not be very bulky from the right side at that intersection. This is a great way of making a quick quilt by putting all 3 layers together in small blocks and then attaching the blocks and finishing the edges with a binding. It's called a quilt-as-you-go technique. In this program of quick quilting by machine, I worked with a relatively new way of straight stitch quilting, using the gridded wax back paper, cutting it to the shape, and then pressing it to the right side of the quilt, stitching along the paper to achieve these very interesting designs. Here the flame stitch, which is sometimes hard to get even and straight, is very easy to stitch just by stitching along this paper. I hope you'll try this straight stitching idea. Did you know that almost 70% of professional embroiderers use one particular brand of thread? That thread is Madeira. Now, the full line of German-made Madeira threads is available to home sewers as well as professionals. Today's sophisticated home sewing machines demand quality threads. When you use Madeira threads in your machines, they will stitch better and your finished products will look more professional. Madeira produces threads and flosses in hundreds of colors for machine, serger, and hand embroidery. Embroiderers prefer Madeira because of its tensile strength and color fastness. I use Madeira and I'm genuinely impressed by its consistent quality. You'll love it too. I would like to talk about one of the fine underwriters of Sewing with Nancy. I'm sure you've noticed I use PFAFF sewing machines and sergers exclusively on my television show and videotapes, and there's a good reason for it. PFAFF machines provide the reliable performance I need, and they're very easy to use. What's more, PFAFF stitch quality is exceptional. So whether I'm using a PFAFF creative model for elaborate fashion sewing or a high-tech serger for home decowork, I know I can count on my PFAFF to help me do my very best sewing every time. And so can you. Your local PFAFF dealer is there to help and can show you the entire PFAFF line. Thanks for joining me. I'm Nancy Zieman. During this program of Sewing with Nancy, I'll be sharing with you more quick quilting ideas by machine. My goal is to show you tried and true quilting gems, plus new quilting jewels that speed along the quilting process. The first technique features how to attach the quilt top, batting, and backing together with continuous scallop quilting. These mini quilts are in the process of being quilted with the help of press-on templates that you can easily make at home. That's what's next on Sewing with Nancy. The continuous line quilting technique looks as interesting from the top side of the fabric as it does from the backing area. You can see on this mini quilt that I've stitched along a scallop design. It's very simple to put together once you know how to cut a template. The template is much different than the types of templates you think about for quilting. It's going to be made out of a paper, a wax-like paper. It has waxing on the back like freezer paper, but this has gridding on the top side, making the measuring of the template very simple. But you could use freezer paper if you wanted to. I'll be using the gridded surface. You'll have to measure the design within your quilt block. This works out best if we're working with quilts that have squares in them. This pre-printed panel is what I'm going to be stitching on, and just measure the size of the square. This happens to be a 4-inch square. Below I have a much larger square that has sashing around it, the strips or the frame. Just measure again within the square for the size, and this happens to be 10.5 inches. So you can see you could use this technique for very mini quilts or larger blocks and quilting ideas. Well, you take that measurement and transfer it onto the paper. We're going to be working, as I mentioned, with the 4-inch measurement, so I'll just find 4 grids. And through this area is where I'm going to mark a template. Use a saucer. I'm going to use a quilting hoop or embroidery hoop. Find the 4-inch lines and draw an arc between the two, a scallop section. I could make a second scallop using that same line just by flipping it, making a mirror image. You're going to have to make quite a few of these. I know for my particular quilt I need 8 of them. And I'll show you how to determine that in just a few minutes. But just mark these arcs. Now, depending upon the size of your saucer or quilt hoop, you'll have more or less shape to that arc. But it will be kind of just about the right size. Maybe it will vary just slightly if you had a bigger plate. With your paper scissors, cut out the shape of the arcs. Simple right now, simple sewing techniques, cutting techniques, but you have now made a template that you're going to stitch along that you can use over and over again. Now these templates are going to be placed on the quilt top starting at the upper right-hand corner. I've already secured the layers together, the top, batting, and backing, and the upper left-hand corner is where we'll always start. Placing this first template from the 4-inch edge to the 4-inch edge, and because it has a wax backing, just press. And that's the line, and let me get it a little straighter. And the wax can get a little hot, but you can see you can reposition this. There we go. That looks better. Position it. Now the first row of quilting is going to be across the top and then down and up this first vertical line. So you'd simply press all these shapes down the area. Now notice the straight blocking, the frame or the sashing around the quilt block does not have a template. We're going to just straight stitch between those areas. And a couple more coming up the side. Now if you had a big quilt, and I'm just working with a mini quilt, you'll have a lot of fabric to your right. So that extra fabric, you should roll it and clamp it as we've done in the preceding programs. And I'll quickly just roll this, and whoop, we'll press that again. We'll roll this up, and you could clamp or pin it. Let me press those down. And I'll clamp these together so that I can stitch this a little bit more easily. And you might have a much larger quilt to hold. But now after I have this positioned, I'll show you how to stitch at the machine starting at this corner. I have my machine set up for a straight stitch, balanced tension, and I have machine quilting thread in the needle as well as in the bobbin. It's going to be very simple sewing using these templates, starting to sew in the upper left-hand corner. First I'm going to lock the stitches, then change to a regular stitch length, sew following this template edge, across and then down the scallops, all this first vertical row, and we'll pivot and go all the way back. Very simple stitching. Now as you'll see as I'm stitching on this very small quilt that there'll be a bulk, a lot of fabric, sometimes in the bed of the machine. So possibly this technique isn't what you'd want to use on a very large quilt, but for baby quilts, mini quilts, it's perfect. Just lock those stitches, lock the threads, and then stitch following the curve of the template. When I get to the corner, I'll set my machine so that it stops with the needle in the down position, or you could simply stop it with the needle in the down position one more time. Raise the presser bar and pivot. Now you can see in the bed of the machine the bulk of the fabric. That's why I rolled it. You would roll it very tightly into a tube and secure it with some quilt clamps. Now at the end of this next scallop, I'm coming to a sashing area. So I'm simply going to raise the presser bar and stitch straight until the next scallop point. And continue. And you get a beautiful design both on the top layer as well as on the backing side with a simple scallop, but it's very tasteful. Now I'm using thread that matches, or a little contrast, so you can see the contrast to the fabric. You might want to consider using a monofilament thread, a clear thread in the top, and a cotton thread that matches the backing in the bobbin. You have lots of options. Now I'm at the end of my first row. So as you might guess, I'm just going to pivot so that I can stitch across to the next row. And then here's where I'll get the bulk of the quilt area to the left of the needle, and I'll sew some more. I'll continue to sew this later on, finishing this whole row. At the end of the row, at the very top edge, I'd lock the stitches again. But I'll show you what you're going to do for the following rows. This little sample shows that this entire area has been stitched up and down this first vertical row. Now release your quilt roll and expose the next row. And you may have to kind of reposition everything. You could cut many more templates, but I'm just going to reposition these to show you that you move the templates over one row, so that this template that was along the top now is along the top of the second row. Then the templates that are along the side, I think you get the general idea, are repositioned to the next row. And you do this repositioning and stitching for all of the vertical sections. And I'll just do one more so that you can see. Even though it's just a wax backing, it comes off very easily and also can be repositioned easily. And I'm just using a dry heat to the iron and press. When you're working on a flat surface, you'll be able to press these a little bit more easily. So then I would stitch starting in this area, lock the stitches, and then sew down and up. Now after all of the rows have been sewn, all the vertical rows, as in this small quilt, then you'd remove them and flip the entire quilt 90 degrees. You'll have half of it stitched. Now if I flip it in this manner, this becomes my new upper left-hand corner, and I'll just make that row as I did initially, and I'll have all four sides of this quilt stitched in no time at all, or all four sides of each quilt block. This mini quilt has been stitched using invisible thread in the top, machine quilting thread in the bobbin. Look at the interesting design that occurs. Because of the sashing and the straight stitching, you have little squares in the middle. It looks as beautiful on the right side as it does on the backing side. The next quick quilting by machine idea is trapunto with stippling. This is a quilt block that's in progress. It would make also a beautiful pillow top. You can see the trapunto, the raised effect of the flower design, and the stippling, the meandering stitches that hold together the top, the batting, and the backing. You could just stipple some fabric or you could just trapunto it. I'm going to show you both and how you could combine them together. The first technique or the first step would be to do the trapunto idea. We're going to use a simpler design, just a simple heart, and cut the design out of that wax back paper or just any type of paper. And we're going to have the trapuntoed area in the gridded section. This has the wax backing so you can press it temporarily onto the top of your quilt block. This would also work out very nicely in garment wear too, to add some little texture. Press it into place, putting it in the center area. Now we need to put a backing and a batting. Let's first talk about the batting in this trapuntoed area. You're going to need a high loft, maybe a little loftier than perhaps a cotton batting. This is the cotton batting that I'm using in the actual quilt block, but it isn't very thick. It quilts by machine very well, but to give some additional depth, you may want to use a couple of layers of polyester batting or the very high loft over 10-ounce weight of polyester batting and place this behind the design, kind of pin in place. Cutting the rectangle of the batting a little bit larger than your design. Simple idea. And then stitch using a decorative thread or whatever thread you're going to be using for your stippling around the outer edges of the design, or another thought, and I'll show you the advantages of this a little bit later, to use a water-soluble thread in the top. We'll dissolve this thread after we're doing the stippling, and it has kind of a nice advantage. But if you don't have this, simply use the thread you're going to be using for the stippling. After stitching, then trim away the excess batting. This sample shows that I've started to trim on this sample, and bevel your scissors or use the bill of your applique scissors to go behind the fabric to prevent you cutting the top fabric, and trim as close as you can. And just trim all the way around the edges as well as this inner section. Now on this sample it's been trimmed totally, and you can kind of see that it has a raised effect at this point by itself. And I'll peel the section. You can see the trapuntoed area and then the traditional batting, and I have the backing, same color fabric, or you could use a muslin if you'd like. Now using the same quilting techniques as we worked with in the first program, start at the center and work outward, making all the layers come together. Now sometimes I pin the top and the batting together and then add the backing as a second step. For smaller quilt blocks, you can kind of do it all in one step. Now when working with the stippling, the stitching at the machine, I'm going to start in the center and work out the same concept of machine quilting that we worked with earlier. This time we'll be doing the meandering sewing. I'd like to show you how to set up your machine for free motion stitching right now. For the first time in this series, I'm going to have you change the settings and the type of stitching that you'll be working with at the sewing machine. Rather than just using a straight stitch, I'm going to have you work with free motion embroidery. The reason for doing this is to work with the stippling stitch. As you look closely at this design, you can see the meandering stitches that form the stippling, or that's called stippling. It would be very difficult to do this curvy stitching with a traditional presser foot on your machine. So that's why I told you I'm going to do the changes. I'm going to set the machine up for free motion stitching, which requires removing the traditional presser foot and putting on a large darning type foot. This foot is what we've used in many other programs on Sewing with Nancy, or on my machine I have the darning foot that came with my machine. The type of thread is also important. You have a little bit more leverage here than traditional quilting. I guess you can always change according to your needs too, but the type of thread that I would like to recommend is either a rayon embroidery thread, which works out very well, or the cotton thread traditionally used for quilting, Or if you wanted the thread to blend in with the fabric, you could use the clear thread, monofilament thread. I like to use a needle that coincides with the thread, so that if you're using a monofilament thread, use a needle that works with that type of thread. Same goes with rayon, a rayon thread. And then place the thread in your bobbin that matches the back of your fabric. I've dropped or lowered the feed dogs, the little grip-like mechanism in the throat plate area, so that it's not going to, these mechanisms are not going to feed the fabric through the machine. You are, with the movement of your hands. Place all the fabric underneath the presser foot area and grab that top thread, turn the flywheel by hand to take one stitch and pull up the bobbin thread. You just want to bring that bobbin thread to the surface, and I've used a contrasting bobbin thread to give you a little bit to see the contrast. Put the presser bar in the darning or sewing position. If you don't, you'll end up with a little thread nest on the wrong side of your fabric, and sew 2 or 3 stitches to lock the threads. We're just working with a straight stitch, and if possible, stop with your needle in the down position, trim off the excess thread tails, and you're ready to do the sewing. You're going to guide the fabric with your hands. That's going to be the movement rather than the feed dogs. You could use a top surface hoop if you'd like to help you with the sewing. And to do the meandering stippling stitch, sew in little waves, little sections. And you do practice this on a sample. Sewing at a relatively fast speed, but moving the hoop slowly. Kind of looks like puzzle pieces. Sewing 1 or 2 waves in one direction. I'd like to fill in about, a 1-inch square or so to begin with. And then after I've completed that 1-inch area, move on to another section. That was about a 1.5-inch area you can see here. I'll work my way around this heart to create the stippling. And it does take a little time to get the hang of this, but it's rather addicting, as you'll soon find out. Remember I told you to use straight pins for this type of quilting, then you can easily move them out. I do prefer this to work with stippling on smaller projects. That's just my preference. And I'll just keep sewing. People who do a lot of stippling recommend not to cross stitching lines. Sometimes I have to if I've gotten a little bit too close, but the general idea is to just make these little meandering puzzle piece looking shapes, and I'm driving the fabric with the hoop, and you can reposition that. If you didn't have a hoop, just use your hands to do the stitching. You can make these stitches as close together as you'd like or as far apart. I think you get the general idea of how this works. After you've stippled all the way around, starting at the center always, working your way out, you can do one final type of stitching, and that is to restitch your trapuntoed area. Half of this heart has been restitched so that all 3 layers, the top, the batting, the backing, are secured. You can see what a more defined stitch it is on this side than it is on the other. If you used washable thread in the top for doing that initial basting stitch, then just use a little spritz of water, and miraculously, I can see this perhaps more clearly than you will, but that first row stitching comes out, just disappears. On the backing area, you have 1 row of stitching to show the trapuntoed area. If you did not have the washable thread, then simply restitch following your initial stitching. You'll just be a little bit more defined. You can see I also did some meandering stitching, some stippling in the center of the heart to give that definition. So whether you're using a simple design such as this, or a more detailed design as our initial quilt block shows, stippling and trapunto is exciting to stitch. Before I wrap up this series, I'd like to quickly detail the continuous scallop edges, how to do the stitching. Remember, I placed the press-on templates across the top of the block and then down and up the first vertical row. After stitching, remove the press-on templates, reposition them along the second row. Again, starting at the top, down and up. Do all the vertical rows in this manner. Remove the templates, then you need to stitch the crosswise rows. And I positioned them Again, just stitching across the top. You can pivot this and then sew across and then back. And that's how you repeat it so that you get this continuous line quilting. I hope you've enjoyed this series and we'll give some of these quilting ideas a try. Bye for now.
Sewing with Nancy has been brought to you in part by PFAFF, simply the best European line of sewing machines. Ginger, a tradition of quality in scissors and shears. Oxmoor House, publishers of sewing, quilting, and craft books. Madeira Threads, designed for home and professional embroiderers everywhere. And by Nancy's Notions Sewing Catalog, featuring specialty sewing books and notions.